Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Brady Grove bringing you another episode of RotoBowler's official MMA podcast. Tap that, and we have a very special interlude edition episode. It's a UFC off week, and with me today, he's on the Sports Gambling Podcast Network, co-host of the MMA Gambling Pod with Jeff the Arctic Fox. He also hosts the Top Turtle MMA podcast, writes for the Sports Gambling Podcast Network, and Cage Side Press. Please welcome Daniel Gumby Vreeland. What's up, Daniel? How's it going, man?
Hey, man, thanks for the enthusiastic intro. Always appreciate
it. And by the way, I'm a big fan of the Sports Gambling Podcast Network, big fan of your show. Love everything they're doing over at that network.
Yeah, well, thank you. And it was it's funny because that was actually the second podcast I started. You mentioned the Top Turtle MMA one. That one's been around for like 6 years. And then when they pulled me over to do, a little bit more gambling specific content, I was, first of all, pumped because I do love that platform, but it has been wild to see how much they've added to that platform over the last couple of years. I mean, they've got a show about literally they got frisbee or ultimate frisbee content going up there, which is crazy, man.
Yeah, and I told you, I am a religious listener of the College Football and College Basketball Experience podcast. A big Colby Dant guy. I think if you don't know anything about sports gambling at all, listening to the Sports Gambling Podcast Network is the best thing you could do to become an expert in very short order.
Yeah, I've always said, like, when I feel like there's some sport I don't know that side about, because I'm a big sports fan, but there are sides I don't know the gambling side too about. Yeah, like they've already got a show for it. I listened to it for like a week, and I feel already much more competent.
And, so we're in an off week for the UFC, and there's been a couple of those lately. It's been weird. And I'm getting married the day of UFC 280. So I'm going to have to be finding moments to go to the bathroom and check the results. Because of all, we didn't know that when we scheduled it. How could we have? But the results of Oliveira Islam, I mean, that's a fight that is getting well hyped up and for good reason. But so in these off weeks, there's always, you know, Cage Warriors has been doing a lot of stuff. It seems like LFA is always on a weekly basis, and UFC Fight Pass has brought it, to a crazy level where you don't have to go a week without watching MMA, and we can follow prospects, at a crazier rate than ever. And the Contender Series this year was awesome. I mean, dude, Bo Nickel, have you ever seen a more impressive performance with a guy with such a limited resume?
No, and it's interesting too because like I know people are head over heels about the guy, and he basically went out and put on two showcase fights, right? Like that's what those were. First one against the guy who's 3-0, which is Zachary Borrego. You can give or take him. But the second one, the one over Donovan Beard, is over a guy who won a CFF title, and not only won a CFF title, he won one over Miles Lee, who's also a really impressive wrestler. So like he had wins over wrestlers, and not only did Bo Nickel go in there, destroy him in short order, but he also like showed off a little bit, right? To like slide off of that mount into a triangle off of his back. He was showing that he's more than just like, a top game power wrestler, which is it's great to see that he wanted to showcase that he's a little bit more.
I was so skeptical going. I usually make my Contender Series picks on Twitter, and I remember thinking, like, dude, I hold Cage Fury in pretty high regard. We're very used to seeing those prospects and those champions make their way to the UFC, and it's an easier transition. I would rank Cage Fury in, maybe the top 5 to 7 feeder promotions at the least. And think it like Donovan Beard, he was a plus 900 underdog, a guy that was their champion and 7-1. And Bo Nickel went out there and in 20 seconds demonstrated almost every skill set that there is in mixed martial arts.
Yeah, and I would say this too. I do think the UFC was careful about booking him. I think they wanted a champion from, like you said, a CFFC, a Cage Warriors, an LFA, even something like Cage Titans, maybe. They were looking for somebody who was a champion so that they could say, hey, look, Bo Nickel just didn't beat 3-0 Zachary Borrego, but he beat a champion at the regional level so that they had like a little bit more merit behind it. but I think they carefully picked who that champion was in Beard, because like if you do go back and watch that fight with Miles Lee, like I said, he won that fight with Miles Lee, but at the same time, he showed a lot of issues with his wrestling. So I think even if he didn't land the big punch early on in the fight, Bo Nickel would have just kind of like took him down and controlled him as much as he needed to. Whereas like they probably could have picked a middleweight champ from one of those other organizations, and maybe he doesn't have such a great time with them. I know they had the LFA middleweight champ on in the first episode, although he wound up getting knocked out by Joseph Pfeiffer. So like they could have gone with somebody more like that, who is a little bit more well-rounded. But I think they sort of picked and choose to make sure that he did look impressive as he did. Because look, he's a meal ticket for the UFC. The UFC knows what they got in him.
There's already odds on bestfightodds.com for Bo Nickel versus Hamzat Chimaev.
I saw that this morning. Yeah, it's crazy. And here's the crazy thing. So, correct me if I'm wrong, because you're the one looking at him right now. I'm not. I think I saw he was posted at plus 250, which, sizable underdog for a guy with as much hype as he does. But we're talking about a guy that he would be fighting in this weird theoretical wild world that just beat Gilbert Burns, just beat one of the best grapplers in the world, Gilbert Burns, one of the best jiu-jitsu specialists in the world, Gilbert Burns. And don't get me wrong, I do think Bo Nickel has shown a lot of promise, but like he's shown a lot of promise against Donovan Beard, a guy with huge gaps in his defensive wrestling. And we got, Khamzat, who just beat an amazing grappler and did so on the feet. And, Gilbert Burns is not a world beater in terms of striking, but he has knocked plenty of people out. He has looked good on the feet. And it's wild to me with the discrepancy in the strength of schedule that like only plus 250 on Bo Nickel. It could just be the books trying to cover themselves.
I think like just like when they release NFL Rookie of the Year odds, I think they're just trying to take advantage of people.
Yeah.
But it is interesting because that kind of gives you an idea of like what they're gonna do with him. Like he's clearly gonna be on a fast track. But, if he just looks good and gets a few wins, he's gonna be right there in the conversation. Deserving or not, he will be there.
I don't know about that though, because I'll say this. I think the book's really excited about it. Like you said, get those odds out as quickly as possible, take advantage of people, get the money pouring in. That money's probably just going to sit there because I don't actually think that fight's going to happen for a while because like they could have, I really, and I said this to a couple of different people, they could have put him as a headliner on a fight night card for his first fight. Right? Like if you put him, let's say versus Kelvin Gastelum, we'll replace Nasruddin Imavov, who's supposed to fight in January. Him versus Calvin Gastelum, a guy who's fought for the title as a fight night headliner. It's one of the most watched fight night headliners in recent memory. I guarantee it would be, right? Like he would instantly sell those tickets. But what did they do instead? They gave him Jamie Pickett. And Jamie Pickett, don't get me wrong, has picked up a couple of wins, has looked decent in his last couple of fights. And this is going to be an opportunity for him to show off again. But like is a really beatable opponent and somebody people probably don't know all that much about. And they're putting it as a pay-per-view headliner. This is a money grab for the UFC because if that pay-per-view for some reason is not selling as well as they wanted to, boom, the Bo Nickel factor. He's the first fight on the pay-per-view, right? They're not gonna keep him out on the free fights on ESPN Plus or ESPN. Like he is going behind that paywall so that you have to pay to watch Bo Nickel content. And I think that's probably what they're going to do with him for the first 3 or 4 fights. Like they've done a similar thing, not that he's as big as a draw, but like they've done a similar thing since Tyson Pedro returned, right? Like he's just beaten the hell out of people in the first fight of a pay-per-view card, right? Like he beat the hell out of Harry Hunsucker, who nobody thought Harry Hunsucker was going to hold a candle to him. I think he was like plus 500 or plus 600. So they know he sells well in, Australia, New Zealand and stuff like that. They know where to place people on a card that is going to maximize the value. And I think they're going to leave him right about there, that like 5th fight on a pay-per-view card, or maybe a 3rd fight on a pay-per-view card, to get the most out of Bo Nickel while he's, hot and definitely untested.
No, that makes sense. It's kind of like the Sugar Sean route, where it's like the Sugar Sean fight against Eddie Wineland. Eddie Wineland, yeah.
Yeah, it was Eddie Wineland.
and yeah, I could see that because he's such a good draw that you can just use him. And the more that he looks impressive, the more that you can milk that. And it's like, if this guy really is that good, he'll be in that conversation. And there's a lot of talk about whether this fight against Petr Yan was advisable for Sean O'Malley. But this isn't boxing. You know, you don't have to stay undefeated to have a chance at the title in the future and to remain a draw. I mean, like Conor McGregor remains a testament to that. That guy could come back and win once, and if a title fight was going to be something that be big money, depending on who has the belt, that's something they'd give him at a moment's notice if it made sense for them.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head in that one. Is that like Sean O'Malley's brand has transcended his wins and losses, right? Like, and you could say the fluke thing about the Marlon Vera loss or whatever, but like the Pedro Munoz no contest sticks out to me more because like his brand did not die down after taking a no contest to Pedro Munoz. Which, by the way, if you go back and look at the release judges scorecards, Sean O'Malley lost the first round. He was losing a fight against Pedro Munoz, who, by the way, had not looked very good as of late. So, like, his brand completely untouched by that fact that he went in, put in a pretty boring performance where he didn't win the first round, and then took a no contest due to stabbing somebody in the eyes. So, if that doesn't take away his brand value and he immediately gets booked with Piotr Jan, losing to Piotr Jan also won't sort of take away that value unless he gets Ben Askren, right? Unless he takes that 6-second flying KO to the teeth and then like he'll never recover from it. But let's face it, Piotr Jan's not the type of dude who, does the Jorge Masvidal route. He's very methodical. He usually comes out slow too, is the other thing I think that the UFC probably likes about this fight is that's going to give, O'Malley some time to dance around. But you're definitely right. He's one of those guys who just is going to have that it factor. He clearly resonates with a younger audience that I quite don't understand at my age. But like he's going to continue to be a draw.
Yeah, and if he does get knocked out in 6 seconds, he can go fight Jake Paul, make a cool 6 million for getting knocked out, and retire.
Yeah, and
But
that's as long as he's not locked into like a 10-year deal. Because I'm sure the UFC knows what they have in Sean O'Malley. He's a guy not represented by an agent, which hey, might be good, might be bad. Who's to really say? But like I think the UFC knows what they're doing and making sure those types of guys don't get out of there on a note that would be detrimental to the UFC.
yeah, and Jamie Pickett is a good matchup for Bo Nickel to go back to that point. Is that like Jamie Pickett is just recognizable enough for that to be a meaningful win? Because what I don't want MMA to turn into is what 99% of boxing is, which is just, fighting nobody. And admittedly so. It's a known, they'll be open about it in boxing that, I'm going to go fight a bum, knock some people out, then I'll take a serious fight. Like it's like, what? That is so different from what we're used to in MMA. And that's why in boxing, when you're going to bet on, a big boxing match, half the time it is a minus 2,400 favorite against a plus 900 underdog fighting for a title, which is a very unusual happening in mixed martial arts.
Yeah, that's true. Although, I guess sort of it sometimes that has to be put into context too, because you're right. In the UFC, the biggest underdog we've ever seen win a fight is plus 950. And typically you don't see odds even that large, but that's the biggest one we've ever seen. And at that same time, right, like boxing, like you said, has those plus 30, 3,000 or plus 2,400s. But I think we have those in MMA too. I just think we don't see them at the highest level. You know what I mean? Like if you look at some of these regional level fights, like for instance, you mentioned some of the Fight Pass shows. FAC is putting together another show this weekend. It's going to air tomorrow, which is Friday at the time of us recording here. We got Elle Wagman, who I'm a big fan of. She's an atom weight moving up to straw weight. She's the girlfriend of Grant Dawson. Absolutely incredible. 5-0. She's fighting Selena Aga, who's, well-traveled, but has a wildly losing record over 30 fights. It's negative 1,700 right now in Elle Wagman. So I'm not saying it happens as much as it does in boxing, but I think if you scour the regionals a little bit, you'll see there's a level of record padding to get yourself to contender series level or LFA title level so that you can just be scooped up when it's time to be scooped up.
Well, this is a weird thing about betting the regionals and betting the contender series and then anything outside of the UFC because the PFL I found I've had the most success picking plus 200 underdogs and greater. Yeah, it seems like some weirder things happen in PFL where, like Ray Cooper, for instance, who I thought legitimately could have been a top 15 welterweight a year ago, and then he starts losing. And PFL, that $1 million prize just drives some people a little bit differently. And then you got Bellator, which has always, for the last handful of years, has had great lighter weight class competition and parity. Back to the Eddie Alvarez days, even. And but when Ben Askren was fighting, as the main event in the middle of an outdoor mall, Bellator has always had good competition at those lighter weight classes. But then they also have guys debuting on Bellator at 0-0 because they're coming off a Division I wrestling championship. And then the Contender Series, as well as anybody that when you bet on mixed martial arts, you have certain criteria in your head that you tend to go with. And with the Contender Series, you can pick a fight as analytically as possible and still come out wrong because a guy that's only fought guys that are 0-2 or worse and knocked them all out, and you're like, well, I don't really trust that guy's level of competition. It just turns out that those guys' talent is for real when it makes it to the Contender Series.
Yeah, and I would say this too about the Contender Series, and I had a little bit of a tough time with it this year. Last year, less so, but one of the biggest issues I had with betting the Contender Series this year was that after that first episode, that Joe Pyfer, be Joe Pyfer speech, I actually found there were a lot of fighters who fought in a style that I had not anticipated. I pride myself in knowing a lot about regional level fighters and being a guy who, sort of has my finger on the pulse even before they get to the Contender Series. Like I was big on Clayton Carpenter and both the Bonfim brothers. And, I know all those guys even before they get signed to Contender Series. And a couple of them just fought in ways that I would have never imagined. I'll give you for instance, that fight between Francis Marshall and Connor Matthews. I think it happened on week 2 or 3 of Contender Series. Connor Matthews is a guy who I've seen live like 4 or 5 times up in the Northeast. A really talented grappler, a guy who brings the pressure, gets finishes early. And I saw a guy in Francis Marshall, a guy who I largely thought the dude just likes to wrestle. He only throws hands to wrestle. And up against a guy like Connor Matthews, who brings the fight to him and is a good grappler, I was like, there's no way that Francis Marshall stands. Francis Marshall. Yes, Francis Marshall. Stands a chance in that fight. So at the end of the day, I was like, there ain't no way he's going to win this fight. So I picked Connor Matthews. I was all over Connor Matthews. I thought the line was great for Connor Matthews. Turns out, because of that Joe Pyfer speech, or at least, I theorized because of that Joe Pyfer speech, Francis Marshall came out and threw his hands. And you know what? His hands look damn good. I don't know why he wasn't using his hands all those years before. I watched him, largely look bad against like a journeyman Ray Trujillo one time in a promotion out of like Mississippi or something like that. He looked terrible trying to throw his little bit of hands before he went to grapple. And instead, he looked untouchable against Connor Matthews. His cardio was great. His hands were great. His pacing was great. He kept his head off the center line. So, like, I think that has been a big issue with the Contender Series for me, is that it's not just that you don't know what to think about their records against, I mentioned the win over Ray Trujillo. Trujillo was 24-30 at the time of that fight. Like journeyman or 0-2 guys, you don't know what to think about those wins. But it's also like you don't know what to think about, like when the pressure changes, when the dynamic of the fight changes, and when it's no longer just about winning. Because on Contender Series, it's not just about winning.
Yeah, you also have to look good. And you see people that get to the Contender Series who clearly aren't handling the pressure right because they're fighting outside of all their strengths and they're going away somehow. It's like there's more emphasis on their strategy. They're so focused on the opportunity and getting the win that they go away from what got them there. But some people, it seems like the pressure brings out, a different level to them. That's the tricky thing about betting on MMA at any level, is that everybody is always in the gym and working on the things that they're not as good at and getting better at the things that they are good at and constantly changing teams. It's so much different than betting on team sports, because at a certain point, you know what you have in a team and it's just about who they're playing. But in MMA, I mean, styles make matchups for sure, but with age, I mean, we see some people, Glover Teixeira, for instance, who arguably reached the peak of their career at the age of 40.
Yeah, no, definitely. And to your point about like people being, constantly working in the gym, and we don't see that, right? And sometimes that's a 3-month gap, 4-month gap, 5-month gap, where, like you said, in team sports, baseball, it's a day at the most. Football, it's a week, every single week. But with, take Daniel Marcos, for instance. He fought Brandon Lewis on, I want to say, episode 8 or 9 of the Contender Series this year. That dude had been away for years, like literal years. Like if you look at his last fight before the Contender Series, it was 2019, the last time he fought. And there you are handicapping whether or not he could beat a guy who's already been on Contender Series and Brandon Lewis. And what did he come out and do? He looked like he had completely changed what he was able to do striking wise. He looked polished on the feet. He looked like he wasn't overextending himself. And it was a step up in competition with 3 years off and a change of gyms and a change of countries. All of that kind of stuff still left him looking good at the end of the night. So yeah, it was I would say a trickier Contender Series than usual.
And so this past weekend was UFC Vegas 61. It was probably the most I don't even want to say slept on, because it was deservedly downplayed. Like, that was not a great they can sell Mackenzie Dern. They easily can, but the card overall was not, it might be the lowest quality card that we've had all year, but still tuned in because it's still the UFC and there's still lines for it. So there was 3 big notes that I had from UFC Vegas 61. One is just Yao Xiaonan and how flawlessly she executed a game plan, and then how close she was to blowing it at the end. And my big pick for last week was Jan by decision plus 330. And so was particularly sweating out the last 30 seconds. But the fact that she was able to get out of the armbar at all, the fact that Brendan Allen's submission hunting finally paid off for him over the last, for the first time in a bit. And then Ilir Latifi, who has made a career impressively. I have to say, this is actually impressive. You look at some of the stats on the fights he's won, you would never guess that this guy's still hanging around the UFC and winning fights. He actually threw way more strikes this time and landed than he has, over his past 5 fights. He beat Tanner Boser with 11 strikes and 2 takedowns.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I'll say this about Ilir TV too. And it kind of speaks to the volume of what you were saying about this card, didn't have really a lot of, I would say, impact on the rankings, right? Like I went to go update my rankings after the fights, and I was like, oh, I think I got to move Yan Xiaonan up a spot, and then I was like, and I'm done. So that was the only update. So, and to your point, it's because a lot of these guys were well traveled, and also maybe just, I don't know, kind of past their prime. Ilir Latifi at 39 years old was the 4th oldest guy on the card. The 4th oldest guy on the card. Jesse Ronson at 36 was the 8th oldest guy on the card. That is a wildly aged out fight card. But yeah, to your point, Latifi, weird win. Brendan Allen doing what we thought he could do at his very height. I will say this about Yan Xiaonan, and I don't want to take anything away from her win, because she did look good stuff in a few takedowns. To me, it does seem more like a lack of progression by Mackenzie Dern. Like she's a phenomenal grappler when she's on top of you, and actually when she's on bottom of you, she's a phenomenal grappler. She has really developed her hands behind Jason Perillo. Like Jason Perillo has really turned her from being a completely one-dimensional fight to having a second dimension. But she just continues to not get all that much better with her wrestling. Like it seems like, we saw her get to the ground twice with Yan Xiaonan. She took her down in the second, damn near finished her there. She took her down in the 5th, damn near finished her there. And at the end of the day, she only got her down twice. And that's somebody who, in Yan Xiaonan, who is largely controlled by Carla Esparza until Carla Esparza finished her. And we obviously don't think of Carla Esparza as this big finisher. We do think her ground game's good and her wrestling's good. But it just goes to show you that Yan Xiaonan is not it's not unstoppable up against a wrestler or a grappler. She, in fact, has looked pretty bad against it. And for some reason, Mackenzie Dern seems like that's the lone area she doesn't seem to be improving. You know what I mean by that?
Yeah, and Yeah, Mackenzie Dern's hands have come along, but there was also the fact that like she was getting tuned up by Jan on the
Mhm.
feet, and she was landing strikes, but even she had to kind of go to a reckless abandonment kind of thing on the feet where she was like walking forward, getting hit, throwing big shots, but even the big shots that landed, it didn't seem like Jan was in too much danger. But that's the thing about Jan. I kind of compared her to Carla Esparza before the card happened because it's like Jan is a person that if you told me she ended up being strawweight champion a year or two from now, I would not be shocked because she has the kind of skill set that on any given night, I think she could beat most of the people in the top 5, top 10, 40 to 45 times out of 100.
Yeah,
She has that skill set like Carla and like Michelle Waterson a couple of years ago and like Caitlin Chukagian before she, the last few years. It's like they have a skill set that is just perfect for eking out close decisions, which,
yeah.
wasn't this one, but that's why I had Jan by decision because I was like, well, I don't think she's going to put her away, but she just has a skill set that is perfect for getting, the better end of the judges' scorecards in a year where that has not been the easiest thing to predict.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because you said it didn't feel like a close decision. It was a draw on one of the judges' scorecards. So like it feels like the widest margin she's won by in a long time, and it still was a draw on one judge's scorecards. And albeit I don't even think a crazy scorecard to say 47-47.
No.
But back to your point, like I think you're 100% right. I think Yan Xiaonan has that ability to like eke out those judges' scorecards, to like look good enough on her feet. And you're right. She did frustrate Mackenzie Dern, and Mackenzie Dern's hands coming along doesn't mean that like, she's a boxer now, but it means that, her striking matches her grappling and she knows how to weave one into the other, which before it was, two completely different skill sets, not blending together at all. So yeah, like Yan Xiaonan is the type of complete fighter who is going to beat somebody like that. So, yeah, I think she's going to have trouble with some of the more powerful fighters in that division. I still think she's going to have trouble with people who can take her down and can grapple her a little bit more. Like I think that's even a path for somebody like Weili Zhang. Those things will continue to hold her back a little bit. But with that being said, you're right. Close decisions all day for her, and it wouldn't be surprising to see her put like 4 or 5 of them together.
Strawweight is an awesome weight class because, I mean, we just saw Cookie Monster regain the title after, it had been the Rose, Joanna, and Wei Li show for, the years before that. Rose is, a phenomenon in many ways, but then to see Carla retake it in the second fight with Rose, but then you look at like, a handful of other fighters at strawweight, and you have no problem seeing a route where they beat Carla Esparza and take the title, and that didn't look like a possibility when Whaley or Rose had it.
Yeah, well, and I'll say this too. In all the props in the world to Carlos Esparza, congratulations on being a champ for a second time. Give me Rose Namajunas with any amount of aggression, and I'll take her to beat Carlos Esparza again. Like I picked Rose Namajunas to win that fight. I still think if Rose Namajunas went after it and had any level of aggression, like and wasn't fighting the weirdest game plan I've ever seen in my life, I'd still take her to beat the heck out of her. And I think that to me is kind of what's weird about the strawweight division right now. I think right now the champ is maybe the third or fourth best fighter in the division, which is such a weird sentence to say because like I don't think Carla is better than Weili. I don't think Carla is better than Rose. And despite having a win over Marina Rodriguez, right now I might take Marina Rodriguez over Carla Esparza. If she could just keep her feet, I think she'd beat the hell out of her on the feet. And then you have people further down that I think also would give Carla a lot of trouble. So yeah, it's an exciting division, and there's also a lot of fun up and comers. There's a lot of weirdness in that division. And in general, like always, the women's lighter weight classes are a lot of fun. For me, it's always been the lighter the women's weight class, the better it is. And I still am one of the people out there pining for the UFC to add atom weight. I know people don't think there's enough women that small in the world. All of the best ones in the world are that small. And as a matter of fact, you got like 5 that are already in the UFC fighting at strawweight who could make that weight, right? Like Loma Luke Bume could make it. Jessica Penne used to make it. Michelle Watterson used to make it. You know, like there are women down there that still could make that weight. And there's a slew of them all over the world too. So yeah, like strawweight's fun for sure, but I think it's mostly fun because it's uncertain too.
Yeah, there's so many prospects at strawweight, and they keep beating each other, so no one's really getting ahead right now. It's kind of a shaking out period. But absolutely about atomweight, I have been saying for years that Michelle Watterson would have possibly been a UFC champion, and a very marketable one at that, had they had an atomweight division. It's just the timing of it. It took time for that to make sense for Dana's wallet, but now it's like if you could just go back a few years and have Michelle Watterson as your champion, that weight class would have sold well.
Yeah, I think so too. And we've seen it time and time again. The only time he adds a new division is when he thinks he's got somebody marketable to sell that division, right? That's why he added women in the first place. We got Ronda Rousey. That's why he added straw weight when he clearly had, first of all, he had the Ultimate Fighter, which had, Rose Namajunas and not Joanna Jacek, Jojo Calderwood, and it had Carla Esparza, and it had a whole bunch of people he knew would sell well. And then on top of that, he knew he had like Waiting the Wings, the Joanna Jaceks of the world, and the Claudia Gadelias. And then he added, flyweight when he knew he had Valentina Shevchenko, who was just like the B-side to Amanda Nunes. And then he added featherweight, if you count that he added featherweight, because he knew Cyborg would sell. And yeah, I think he kind of missed the boat because Michelle Watterson might have been the right one to take that all over, probably somewhere right after her Invicta. I think it was Invicta 5. She fought Jessica Penne. If he had done it then, for sure. But then, of course, like right before he was about to bring her over to the UFC, she loses that fight to Erica Tiburcio. And like that probably threw a weird, sort of a weird swing into things because Tuberculo obviously, didn't stick around very long. She lost to Hamasaki right away and Jinyu Fry. And neither of them are quite as marketable in America, or at least, not Hamasaki is not as marketable in America as, somebody like Watterson would have been. But I think really at the end of the day, that's what it's about, is like finding the right person to market the atomweight division and to sort of bring it into the public's conscious, because they're probably going to have to do it with a big tournament, right, to give away the title, and they're probably going to need a big face in the Ultimate Fighter house.
Well, not only that, and I hate to say this but it is 2022, the way that this has worked out. I feel like when atomweight comes along and a Grand Prix inevitably decides a champion, I think it'll end up being the 4 to 8 with the biggest OnlyFan followers. Yeah, that is the way the trend has been going. That's how it seems like that's been a bigger thing with women's MMA lately. And, all the power to everybody. It seems like it's been a great thing for people, especially who are, getting closer to retirement. But like social media has really opened up a lot more possibilities that I don't think Dana is yet considering that seriously. But I think that that's soon coming, because everybody always likes to point back to the clip where he said women will never be in MMA. Look, Dana's very open-minded. He's stubborn but open-minded. It just has to make sense for him financially. And he never likes to do anything when he thinks he's being told to.
Yeah, I'll also say this, like to your point, it seems like they're trying to find more marketable, pretty, quote unquote, pretty faces, right, to be on the show. Right. I think that changes based on the structure of the Ultimate Fighter season too, because like, to your point, when they did that for, they did that on the most recent season of the Ultimate Fighter. The most recent season of the Ultimate Fighter did not pull the best fighters, right? I love Zach Ponga, love Mohammed Usman, love Juliana Miller. They all probably would lose fights on the Contender Series if you put them in the Contender Series against, I don't know, just about any heavyweight / light heavyweight you could have run them against, and just about any feather or flyweight you could have run them against that made the show. Like, if you put Bruna Brazil up against any of those women in that show, Bruna Brazil runs them over. Yeah. And like, you're right. So it didn't draw the best talent. But when you go back and you look at the one where, the end of the show was for a championship, like when we take off, let me think. It was the flyweight season. I'm trying to remember exactly the people in the show, but the people in the show from the flyweight season were infinitely better than what we typically see, right? They were infinitely more skilled. They pulled a higher level. And even in like the flyweight season, when the champion was going to get a shot against Demetrius Johnson, like we saw dudes go in there into the Ultimate Fighter house and come out stars, right? Like that's where we got Tim Kennedy, or Tim Elliott rather, not Tim Kennedy. So like I think it depends on what's on the line at the end of the day. Because if what's on the line is like a title, right? And granted, Nico Montano wound up winning that title, but like if what's on the line is the title, you get the Montana De La Rosas and the Lauren Murphys and the Barb Honshocks and the Roxanne Modafaris and the Sajara Eubankses and the Jillian Robertsons. Like that's a higher level of fighter than you get on the other seasons. So I think if they did it with Atom Weight, you do see the Hamasakis of the world or the Sohi Hams of the world like make it out to the show and like put on for it. Now, granted, that's if they got released from all their contracts and stuff, but like I think you see those types come out for the show if that's the case.
It's just we're in an era where there's more talent in mixed martial arts than ever before, and so they kind of have their pick. They can almost do both sides at this point. They have formats to find quality and they have their formats to find stars, which are two very different things.
Yeah, and I think that's why we see the Ultimate Fighter being more of the one that does that star one, and maybe why we wouldn't see an atom weight tournament for the end of that, because you're right. Contender Series seems to be the one where they're finding talent, and Ultimate Fighter seems to be the one where they're trying to find personalities and people who sell.
All right, Daniel, we're about to the point where we got to get out of here. Before we go, is there anything you want to shout out? Anything you want to say? The floor is yours.
No, I mean, like you can follow me on social media at I'm on just pretty much Twitter of all places, at Gumby Vreeland. You can find, whatever podcast or thing I'm writing is available there. Check out the latest edition of the Top Turtle MMA podcast. I don't know when this comes out, but I got some interviews with both Jonathan Martinez, who's fighting Cub Swanson pretty soon, and Mana Martinez on there. And next week, I'm going to have on Chelsea Chandler, fresh off of that win at UFC 61, nice. Telling stories about how Nate Diaz got her into MMA. So all good stuff. Make sure you check out all that and follow me on Twitter.
All right, folks, that is it for this very special edition of an interlude episode for RotoBallers' official MMA podcast. Tap that. I am Brady Grove, and you can follow me on Twitter at RotoBrady. We're in an off week for the UFC, but we're going to be back with UFC Vegas 62 the next week. Back to business as usual. Have a great week, everybody. Peace.